Of course, like many of you, we're coming to you live from whatever space in our house we could find to have a little office. And with our 3.5 months in, lack of a haircut, doing the best we can to stay presentable and bring the latest that we've learned from the public engagement work across the country. So today we're excited to share some updates from a survey that we recently conducted, a nationwide outreach, bringing in comments and insights from every corner of the country and even Canada, and have a number of things to share in terms of what we've heard. We've also got a decent pile of data in terms of looking at the first wave of virtual engagement and how that's gone and what's working and what's maybe changing as the situation evolves. I think it's important for us to recognize that since the last time we had an MPO DOT webinar, a lot of things have changed. We've certainly had webinars covering the impact of COVID-19 and how engagement has gone more virtual. However, the last time we talked, things were very different in the country. And I think it's important to recognize that across the US and the world, people are waking up to the historic injustice that has impacted communities of color and specifically Black Americans. And as more people wake up to that reality and as it becomes more clear that systemic racism persists and that there are challenges that are still ahead of us in getting through that, it's important to recognize our role in improving the world and working towards a solution. So specifically when we think about MPO and DOT engagement efforts, we have a big part to play. When we think about environmental justice, and Title VI communities and legislation around that, fulfilling the intent of the National Environmental Policy Act and otherwise federal law that has been directed at this problem. There's a big role that we can all play in improving access, improving equity of outcomes. So it's important to keep that in mind as we jump in today to talk about how our world is changing right beneath our feet. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Graham here to share a quote to get us started in terms of what we're hearing, and we'll cover some of the survey results and what we heard from you.
Yeah, and thanks, Jay, for I think taking the time to make that sort of awareness a priority. I think taking some notes from other places, Canada, Australia, countries that are dealing with similar issues, that's a great way to open up all of these discussions, right? Keeping these types of challenges front of mind. So thank you. And I do want to start this off with one of the comments actually that we received as a part of this listening effort. I think that one of the primary things we need to be aware of, here at Public Input, right, is the need for crowdsourcing, the need for peer-to-peer sharing. This is something that a lot of you watching today are aware of. You've been a part of these calls in the past. You've participated in these calls, and we don't want to change that approach. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks for allowing us to be a part of the discussion. And I'll start it off by quoting a participant from up in Connecticut. This is a fairly long comment that was left in our survey. We broke it into two halves here, but it encompasses quite a bit. The first part, virtual platforms and our proficiency at using them are evolving, and the 2-month mandated change in business practice has allowed us to leapfrog our technology use. This is the glass half full, absolutely. We know that prior to these types of virtual public involvement tools have been a supplement, right? Looking to improve the representation, improve the participation, the equity in public involvement efforts. But now they are a need to have. And so as a platform, we've found ourselves to be in a position to help and found ourselves at the center of a solution, and couldn't be more grateful to be in that place. But there's an additional aspect to the comment that continues to say, these new technologies have the ability to improve access for many disadvantaged groups by expanding the time at which people can participate. So not only being a place for these projects to continue, right, regardless of the ability to meet in person, but also a place to broaden the people we hear from, and increase the equity, as Jay was talking. This particular comment, I really appreciated it, and I'm actually reading right now off of some of the notes I took, so I don't confuse the statement. But it goes on to talk about a little bit more in the idea that knowing that recording of meetings, these types of public meetings being recorded and posted, right, gives people the opportunity to participate at times when it's more convenient. Having the opportunity for access, without internet, disadvantaged groups being able to see that these meetings are not just online or offline, but maybe over the phone, as many of you are today. And it goes on, the last thing I want to point out is that the FHWA's virtual public involvement resources are worth a look. And we couldn't agree more. The FHWA is a group that we talk to regularly, and the VPI specific, the virtual public involvement initiative out of the Everyday Counts 5 part of that is really a wonderful peer-to-peer exchange, and couldn't agree more, and appreciate this participant bringing that up. And we would steer everybody to those resources as a place to learn from each other. But wanting to tack on to those efforts, knowing that we've got a tool, right, to listen, we really wanted to embark, I suppose is the right word, on an effort in this time of uncertainty, in this time of change, and ask everybody what you think. What do you see? What are the challenges? And we heard from I think it was roughly 50 agencies across the country, as you can see spread out here on this is our reporting structure. So we know we've got a really nice representation geographically. We had quite a few insights that we gleaned from this broad swath of MPOs and DOTs. Most, at the highest level, I should say, most common challenges we heard really involved this, we'll call it a stressor cycle. So at this moment in time, we're at this intersection of almost career defining challenges, right? You've got how to continue these projects in the midst of funding cuts, in the midst of calls for reform at the local level with police, in the midst of an inability to have anything. I quoted, actually, there was a local government response that said everything we used to know is upside down and sideways. And so all of us are looking, right, in this time of need for new ways to engage, tools, right, to have in our pockets and leverage. And the challenge that a lot of people have expressed is adapting to those tools, teaching people how to use those tools, what those tools are. Of course, as a software, we're excited to present solutions. But the need to learn our platform is the same, right? Everybody is looking to new things, and therefore we're distracted, right, from that need to connect with people and deliver the kind of engagement to keep our projects on track, to make sure we're in compliance. And so we have this cycle that we're really hoping to be able to provide some information to you today to break out of. One of the main things, though, we're going to talk about is the actual survey. And what we heard really can be broken down into a couple of different departments. The first is well known, delayed, or at least, if not canceled, at least delayed projects. Every single group we heard from had some form of delayed or put off projects. And then also compliance. When you're looking to virtual meetings, how to stay in compliance. What's the guidance from FHWA on this? How are we knowing that we're not going to run outside of those lines? And then effectiveness of other outreach tactics. So knowing that we've been using a wide variety of communications tools, are those effective at this time? Or, how are we reaching people when they can't come out of their homes, at least comfortably? And then what's the future of public meetings and virtual tactics like this as we move forward into what we call, I suppose, the next normal? It seems to be the term that everyone's adopting. What does that look like? How can we go back to what we knew in traditional meetings and incorporate what we've learned? So we'll touch on a number of those things, but first we'll answer the survey question that that asked, have you been able to engage, just period, right, the public on your projects since, we'll call it mid-March, as COVID-19 became a reality in this country? And interestingly, like I said, over half of you have seen delays in some form or fashion, there is a, obvious reason for this. There's a challenge around how to reach people. There's a challenge with compliance. We just don't know, right, what these new technology tools will allow for, the hurdles in learning them. But most importantly, what we heard in digging into that information was uncertainty with compliance in meetings and public records laws. So talking about virtual meetings as kind of the primary area for concern that we heard, a lot of you have been forced, I suppose is the best way to put it, to choose between security and accessibility. So a number of you have attended our webinars in the past couple of months and heard us talking about the challenges around a virtual meeting and learned about our particular solution to try to bridge this gap. But the main thing that we've been forced to look to is whether or not we have a password and we're leveraging a video conferencing platform like Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeetings, or whether or not we have an open meeting in the form that we used to be able to say was truly accessible. Drop in, right? Show up at the local community center, the library, town hall, wherever we're hosting them, and just show up, right? So we've been working really hard with a lot of different organizations. We've mentioned the UNC School of Government here in North Carolina, and discussions with them around what to expect. We had Dan Beverly, the Executive Director of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, on a webinar with us a little over a month ago. And Dan offered some interesting insights. He said that what we need to do is utilize technology to replicate and improve the administrative process. And he went on to say in between there that this is rather than reinvent. So replicating the process to provide people the opportunity to drop in, to provide the people the opportunity to comment at ease, and then also, right, embracing a cultural change in how we manage public engagement and the public records, right, that come from those. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of you have experienced in leaning on video conferencing as your virtual public meetings tool is how to attribute those public comments, how to make sure that they have been collected, formatted, organized, and included in reports for your compliance. So this is a big change, a big shift in what we're having to manage, right, as the people responsible for decisions on behalf of the general public. But I don't want to say it's all challenges, right? We've seen a lot of benefits coming out of the virtual public engagement efforts, and the first one that I want to add, is really legal, as everybody is looking to ensure compliance. What we're seeing and what we're hearing is that there is additional legal protection almost as you increase that sort of digital and data management that virtual tools, that digital tools allow. And so when you have all of those records, because they were submitted virtually, it's consolidating them into a place. You've got all of them are transcribed in a written format, and as long as you're providing multiple and redundant ways, we'll talk about that term specifically in a minute. As long as you're providing the public with multiple and redundant ways to participate virtually, you're protecting yourself against those due process concerns with regards to legal challenges if someone isn't in favor of a decision you've made. We've seen a number of legal opinions saying that is the best way to make sure that you can defend yourself when someone may be opposed and looking for an opportunity to try to slow a project or even shut it down. And then, of course, this one's political is a little bit more obvious. But as we have more opportunity to engage without having to come to a meeting, without having to come out of our homes and make the time and incur the cost of showing up in person, trust is inevitably built. More involvement equals more trust, and that's a strong political benefit. Technologically, too, this transformation is really showing us what we can do with regards to data. You'll hear Jay and I talk a lot about data management as kind of the primary value we see in when you go virtual. How to know who you've heard from, how to know what they've said, know when that was said, and then of course, find those people again and do a better job of hearing from them because you've got the data to support. But these technological tools, this virtual public involvement, allows that to be stored again, right? Not in spreadsheets as status quo oftentimes was, but in a place, in a database where you can share that information with project teams, consulting firms, other departments, divisions. And lastly, actually, we were on a call this morning with our friends at the North Carolina DOT. Being down the street from them has been a wonderful privilege, and we really do appreciate the transparency that they offer us as a customer. And they actually supported what we had talked about in a previous webinar. Florida DOT reported in an FHWA webinar that they saw their meetings costs go from an average of $50,000 to $20,000, and when they went virtual. And the North Carolina folks said something similar. They said their average, in-person meetings could sometimes go upwards of $100,000 when they had the consultants traveling. And so these virtual opportunities really can provide that savings. And we want to embrace that, of course, as we're seeing budgets and the gas tax, being much lower revenue generating, budgets being cut, and us having to be more resourceful. The next question we asked was along the lines of the methods you've used. So we talk about meetings a lot because that's the most visual and the newest, right, method. But a lot of you have turned to a broad variety of methods to engage the public in this time. And actually more of you leaned on website updates rather than online and virtual public meetings. Interestingly, and I'm really excited to see this, the social media effort has increased too. We Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these places, they find themselves in the headlines of the news for unfortunate reasons here and there, but they are still one of the best ways to get the message out to the public, because we know that if you just update a website or you just host a virtual public meeting, we need to make sure that people see that. We need to have those outbound efforts. So that's where social media and email come into play, those outbound communications efforts to bring people to your new engagement tactics. I will point out that one of the things I see here that's least leveraged, the text messaging, is actually one of the most effective ways that we can get the attention of the public. There was a statistic that we saw come out like maybe a few months ago at this point, but 90% of text messages are received and opened within 3 minutes of them going out. So the penetration of these messages and the way that they find people wherever they are is really second to none. So we want to see people leveraging text messaging and SMS more as a way to get people aware of these different tactics. I'm going to sort of follow that up though, because it's very similar. If you look at the correlation, we saw email and website updates and virtual public meetings, right, as the top ways to engage right now. What were the methods we're using? It's interesting, right, because those are some of the primary ones that directly correlate with compliance. Are we in compliance if we're hosting a virtual public meeting? And the questions, we field this more often than just about any other question. Can you say what the FHWA or the FTA is saying with regards to compliance and virtual public meetings? It is the highest concern, followed closely by keeping projects on track, which of course makes sense. And then not far behind is representative and equitable engagement. And so as I look through those challenges, we see, right, those compliance concerns, that equitable engagement. So we look to, right, our leadership as a place for guidance there. So did the third question there, local or state officials temporarily amend guidelines for public meetings, amend state law or executive orders? And obviously, as so many of you had turned to virtual public meetings, The answer is yes. Did your local or state official temporary amend guidelines? Yes, but there were caveats. And this isn't something we have, I think, talked about at length, but the suspension of those various meeting laws or those amendments of executive orders, they came with caveats, right? It still meant that they had to be open, they had to be transparent, and they had to offer a means, an accessible means for the public to participate. There, in other words, was really no guidance. There was no, here's how we would recommend you do that. As we do so well, we say, no, it's on you. Come up with solutions to this problem. Everybody is smart, everybody's creative, but we're all facing this challenge, this comment, which was submitted anonymously. We embrace the anonymous side of these types of engagement because it's more, people can be more open, right, about their thoughts. But this participant said the biggest concerns are environmental justice and Title VI communities. They have lower access to technology and online tools for the most part. And that is true. These environmental justice, Title VI communities, I'll add to that. We're looking at rural communities. We're looking at people who work in jobs that may prevent them from being tied to their inbox, may prevent them from being available even during the day. If you're a third or fourth shift worker, you're asleep when these types of things are happening. And if you're a driver for a logistics company, right, you're on the road, and you're focused, and you can't take a break to see what's in your inbox. So I would say take it beyond environmental justice and Title VI and include the people who are really making the country run at this moment with our logistics firms and having their ability to participate. And I'll go back to, there's been vague direction from the federal government on how to proceed. Everyone is hesitant to rely on online meetings because of the fear that they will be scrutinized and deemed insufficient. So exactly what we were talking about, the concern that we are opening ourselves up in relying on these things to having projects be delayed or derailed if somebody comes and says, no, that wasn't enough, right? How to make sure we check that box. As I quote one of the attorneys general, there were numerous attorneys general that came out and said various interpretations of the executive orders and the suspension of open meetings rules. Mark Herring of Virginia said, the fundamental commitment to openness must be upheld and maintained, even as we consider alternative methods to conduct the operation of government. And really what that says to us is it's on us as providers of solutions, as people who can build technology to help you solve these problems, to give you the tools, because the guidance is really vague, that can help solve these problems. And for us to do the research and talk to these people about whether or not it will in fact be a qualified solution. One of the primary things I want to take a moment, sort of step back and hit on here, is that accessibility and equity do go hand in hand. Jay mentioned earlier that equity is a massive movement right now for the ability to not just hear increased numbers of people and have a greater response overall, but have an understanding of who we've heard from, have a representative audience and a representative data set, equity, and the understanding that there are underrepresented communities we need to hear from. And so I mentioned lack of broadband access, mentioned people with jobs that prevent them from being tied to their inbox or the opportunity to attend a meeting. We know that 95% of Americans own a cell phone. And so note that that's not a smartphone. That number is a little bit farther down at around 70 to 80%. But a cell phone, which means that they can receive text messages, right? And like I said earlier, 90% of text messages are read within the first 3 minutes. So that is an incredible way to reach a huge swath of the population. We also have to keep in mind that 20% of Americans in general, and a higher number, 35 or so percent of minorities, rely on their mobile phone entirely for the internet. So they do not have broadband or laptop like I am in front of today to participate in some form of virtual meeting. They look on their phone. So we have to be mobile friendly. We have to be, and this is a little techie, but we have to be conservative about the data and how much that consumes, because these people do not necessarily have unlimited data plans. So a virtual meeting becomes a challenge for those people. And we can't say that just because 95% of people own a cell phone, with the 5%, we're not going to pay attention to. That we have to go beyond, and we have to look for other things like mailers. We have to look for those direct opportunities to engage with people. And so this is a graphic many of you have probably seen, and it really encompasses what we as a company focus on. Mixed mode engagement, and the research shows that it's really the only way to reach every corner of the community equitably. We've seen that it optimizes data collection and can reduce survey error because it increases the size, the sample size, and opens up for for those other subsets of people who may not participate just by one format, such as rural residents. We see increased participation when you use mixed mode methods, and older populations may not be so inclined to adopt new technologies. I say older populations. I've been corrected in these before by saying that that's not a broad blanket statement by any means, but we do need to know that there are certain populations who are have difficulty with technology, and we need to embrace multiple modes like phones, text messages, mailers, those ways to reach these people in their homes without requiring them to log on. And that really goes back to what I said earlier, the multiple and redundant means of access to protect the decisions you make. So guidance from various legal firms and attorneys general have said that when you leverage multiple and redundant means to offer comments at public meetings, right, that is the best practice to make sure, right, that you've given everybody a chance, and they can't come back and say, well, my audio was cut off, or I wasn't able to make the video conference meeting because I didn't have a laptop. We have numerous ways. So if you take nothing else from this portion of our webinar, it's that you have to have a number of different formats for communication in every different public involvement effort. Kind of wrapping up on some of our survey responses, we couldn't ignore reopening. And it's kind of what it's what instigated this listening effort in the first place, as we're all looking for a chance to kickstart the economy, get back out from our homes and interact with our friends and our families, return to church services and go out and buy groceries even. It's, we're all on the same page. So one of the questions that we ask, are you considering in-person public meetings? Are you going to embrace these reopenings across the states? And I would say that in the last couple of weeks, as we've seen numbers of cases of COVID-19 increase in a number of different states, the sentiment around this may have changed. But when we had this survey, when we wrapped it up several weeks ago, almost half of you still said no, we're not going to. And then another quarter said not sure, and the last quarter said yes. So we dove deeper into why are you not going to, are you not sure about holding an in-person meeting? And of course, fear of public health issues. The coronavirus is still gripping the nation, and we're not sure how to respond. But there's also a couple of other elements we heard. The convenience of engaging virtually. And that encompasses cost savings, that encompasses better participation because people can do it from their homes. They don't have to worry about being able to get there. And then lastly, right, this could last a while. So some of our clients have come to us, and we're helping them with their meetings, and we've discussed reopening and the ability to move away from a reliance on our platform for their public meetings. And they said, well, finally, our state is opening back up. So what we're going to do is we're going to back off the public meetings, and we're going to start doing in person. And that's exciting. But we're looking into the data from the general public sentiment. And so it had some interesting information come to light. And if you ask the general public back in March, whether or not they would be scared, right, of attending a big event, 44% said yes. And if you ask the general public last month in May, 60% said yes. So actually, as we've progressed through this pandemic, people have become more fearful of attending group gatherings. And there is a general consensus that even after the CDC and local governments say it's safe, people are going to attend fewer public meetings. What the big picture that we're trying to convey here is, this is not something that we can come back from. We need to embrace that this is the next normal. We need to know that even if you're allowed, your residents, the people who rely on you for decision making, are not comfortable in coming back in. We have to respect that. Kirsten Wyatt, the executive director at the Engaging Local Government Leaders group, if you've not heard of them, they are focused a little bit more on local governments, so municipal, county level, but they are an immense wealth of information with regards to public engagement tactics, with regards to diversity in the industry. And she had it, I think, on the nose with some bells can't be unrung. And out of necessity, government organizations are adopting more virtual tactics and getting the opportunity to strategize with them. So that realization, that opportunity, right, to learn and strategize with these tools, now that they're not a nice to have, but a need to have, communities and the residents in those communities are going to expect them in the future. There is likely no going back. And I couldn't agree more with Kirsten, not just as a platform that is built on the idea we want to bring more people into the fold, but out of the respect for the people who are just fearful of their friends and family's health and who don't know enough to make these decisions. We need to know that those people are part of the conversation, and we need to know that those people are still going to be able to participate. I was not going to include this up until I think 2 or 3 days ago in this presentation, but I was sitting in on another webinar and I was listening carefully to how the Air Force, right, and the OODA loop is not, I think, specific to just the Air Force, but it is, it's a universal sort of way to adapt to the changing environment. The Air Force, right, says, well, of course, first we observe, right? We sit and we take a second and we see what the environment looks like. So in late March, we were doing exactly that. And us too, in late March, we issued it as a work from home decision, and everybody at the company is working remotely still. And we sat back and we asked our customers, and we asked the MPO DOT world, I suppose, what are you seeing? A lot like what we're doing now. And then it was time to orient. Okay, now we see, here's the issue, here are the challenges, here's some opportunities. So that was early April. Mid-April, most of you had decided on going virtual, public meetings, the need to do that to keep your projects moving. We decided on rolling out a platform to assist in that. Everybody was finding a solution, and then it quickly, right, became act. We have to get back on track. We can't stall our projects anymore. We have to move. So that OODA loop throughout the month of April took place. And I would argue that we're right back now in that observe fashion. We need to start seeing what is out there. We need to take stock of what we have. And then in webinars such as this one and many others, we are not the only group that is data collecting and sharing the information. We need to go and we need to start to orient ourselves with this next normal and decide on what to do. Good friend over in WashDOT, in their Verge group, put it really well. He said, we're doing the best we can in a virtual sense to keep engagements occurring and expectations met. And that's exactly the way we see it. We are all in this OODA loop and doing the best we can with the data we have. And now is the time, right, to reorient ourselves and to start looking at what those next decisions are going to be. And I want to turn it over to Jay. I think I've probably spoken enough for all of you, and in sharing these survey results and some of the information. I want to turn it over to Jay to talk a little bit about how we see the next normal evolving, how our software, of course, is going to play a role in that. So Jay, if you want to if you want to take the mic and maybe talk through some of that, I really appreciate it.
For sure, Graham. Thanks for covering all that stuff. The survey results are always exciting for us to dive in and look through. And in this case, it really echoed a lot of the things that we had seen firsthand. There's a lot that is the same, but then there's a ton of stuff that's changing. So I think really to kick off into the next chapter of this in the presentation today, it's important to recognize what you said earlier about the trade-offs that come with virtual engagement, and that really looked like an either or thing early on. And that was the accessibility factor and the security factor. So the challenge is with the traditional tools that are out there, when we try to make things more accessible, such as access to the virtual meeting, we make it harder to keep it secure. So if you're using a traditional conferencing tool, and if you open that up and provide ways to access that, there are chances that people can interfere with the operation of the meeting or post things that are disruptive or disrespectful to others. So the key challenges that emerge there are that we do want to provide low barriers to participation. We want to provide, as you mentioned, Graham, multiple redundant ways of participating, but we don't want to sacrifice the security of our process and really a predictable approach for staff and for stakeholders and consultants that are involved in these projects. So the philosophy that we followed and the technical approach that we're taking is to essentially solve at least the real-time component of this with two rooms. So one of those being the one that many of you are watching from today, the live broadcast online. You can require registration if you want to, but really we're advocating for, just like any other meeting, people can show up, attend, and then choose to provide whatever degree of information they'd like to provide. They can also dial in by phone if they don't have broadband access. And really some great questions earlier around accessibility that we'll jump into next as well. But ultimately, by creating those two different spaces, you can create a very secure, predictable environment for your team and your presenters, while also providing a lot of access and ease of use for the public. So that's the model that's emerged, and really we're seeing teams start to have a lot of success with that. So that's exciting. But towards the data that's come in over the past few weeks, this is the part where I nerd out a little bit and think about what is changing and can we measure that change and quantify it. If we want to check out the next slide here, we talked about Ohio DOT. Can I come back to this one, Heather? We'll jump ahead to the total numbers, and then I'll talk through Ohio's example. So when we looked at the numbers pre and post COVID, there's a few interesting things that emerged. So as an engagement platform, we have a number of in-person meeting tools, and that gave us an interesting data sample prior to COVID to work with. So we eliminated meetings that didn't have really high quality sign-in data or attendance data, and narrowed it down to about 217 meetings that we could compare with their virtual counterparts. So from a sample of 95 virtual public meetings that were held in April and May by over 30 organizations, the big difference is that we saw over double the attendance and engagement from the virtual events relative to the in-person events. And of course that can make sense in the context of like, well, it's easier to access, but this is looking at it just for the people that were attending during the event, not just the online aspect pre and post event. So what we're seeing with virtual is that not only is this yielding a cost savings, as Graham mentioned with Florida DOT and others, it's also yielding greater engagement, quantifiably better engagement. And that's a major win when we think about the process and the expectations that we're held to in terms of showing that we've engaged a broad sample of the community. And really, if we look towards the folks that are currently doing this work and those meetings that happened, I think the Ohio DOT example is a great one. We could jump back over to there, kind of talk through. So as we mentioned, there's those aspects of it that are the public conference room and the private kind of presenter secure area. In this case, ODOT was one of the first to really launch that approach for DOTs. And they've done a great job in terms of training a number of different team members, and a big kudos to Jackie on their team to coach folks through the process and be available as different project managers learn to manage these meetings and host the public hearing aspects of that. But it's been really great to see their work and the work of a number of MPOs, Sarasota, and the RPC, and a number of others. I'm leaving out plenty of folks that are doing great things. But the key things to note here are that they are providing a public-facing site where people can drop in and watch and just listen to the proceedings of the meeting and watch the presentation. That's of course recorded and left online, just like today's presentation. After we get done here, will be available to share via the embedded YouTube video that lives here. So if you do want to share this with any peers, you can just grab the URL at the top of the screen and share that at any point. And there's another element of this where the accessibility features. So, when we look at why YouTube or Facebook, these are social platforms that we're essentially tying in the public input toolkit into. Why aren't we running our own broadcast? Well, we're certainly working on our own live streaming capabilities for a number of reasons, but the really high bar that YouTube and Facebook set is that they build in accessibility and multi-browser, multi-device support. And so after today's event, if you go back on here, YouTube will have probably auto-generated closed captioning elements, and it's easy for people with even kind of older browsers to access the video. There are still some browser types that can't reach there, but again, providing these multiple and redundant ways of commenting and participating help mitigate even those technical challenges. So kudos to the teams that are out there creating these environments for accessible and secure meetings. And we're thrilled that everyone we're working with is seeing that their process has been approved and is being deemed as a valid public engagement process, thanks to the extra efforts they're putting in to show that they can make this more accessible and reach traditionally underserved communities. So keep up the great work. That's exciting to see. Another data element that's wild to share is really the unprecedented desire for people to be heard. Just in the month of May alone, we saw the greatest uptick in public engagement and comments collected on the platform. So for context, on average, we'll see 5,000 to 10,000 comments per month across a little over 200 organizations using the platform. Last month, that went from about 8,000 on average to 83,000 total comments collected. This chart is showing the total volume of those comments, of how much was written. And if you look at last month alone, you could fill, I believe it's Homer's Odyssey, you could fill the book 23 times over with the written comments that were collected. That's beyond imagination in a lot of ways. So a big focus of ours as well, of course, is helping you analyze that. So the qualitative analysis tools are more important than ever. We've certainly had to ramp up our machine learning expenses in terms of processing that text and trying to gather themes out of it. But really the thing to take home here is that people want a voice. It's important, of course, to create visually appealing content. It's important to put our best foot forward in terms of how we talk about our projects and our work. But the paramount thing when we think about engagement is giving people the ability to share their voice and to have a voice in the public process. So with that in mind, we'll think about what does the next normal look like? And a caveat here, I don't necessarily love the term next normal. I don't know if we're going to have a normal for a very long time. But in terms of where public engagement is going, there's a few trends that are really clear. One is this in-person element coming back to some degree, but given the budget cuts and just really the benefits that all the different stakeholders in this process are seeing from virtual, we believe that in-person will be more of a supplement to the virtual, and that it'll probably happen less frequently, just from a cost savings perspective and just the sheer amount of effort it takes to put together an in-person relative to a virtual event. So after that, there's this other trend of this mixed mode outreach. as Graham framed, the multiple redundant methods of access, that's going to stay. That just over the last 10 years has been proven time and again to be a more effective way of gathering feedback. And of course, it's more statistically valid in terms of providing a broader, more diverse sample. So we'll see that stick around. The element we've spoken to today, and I think we're hearing in more and more of our conversations, is an increased focus on environmental justice and Title VI communities. That has been federal law for quite a while now, but given our current environment, it's paramount. It's a big key to ensuring that we're doing right by the communities we serve, and that our work is being inclusive and is moving society in the right direction. And lastly, the fun part that emerges and the element that can make the work a little easier for all teams is this digital relationship management component. The analogy we sometimes use is Groundhog Day, in the sense that every time you have a new project come down the pike as part of a STIP or TIP, it's like we're starting our process over again when it comes to public engagement. We've got to go try to figure out who in the community we can reach out to get the word out to different community segments and groups. We've got to go try to find contact lists. We've got to go look up what different press organizations we can try to put out a press release with. And what digital relationship management does is it shows that through virtual engagement, you're capturing contact info and a way to follow up with people. And you're remembering and storing in a database the folks like the ones, I know in the South, we use the term LARC. It's like a local area representative. Graham, you had the
local area resource contact.
Exactly. So these are the faith community leaders, radio personalities, and others that can get the word out to specific parts of the community, including those folks as part of your essentially database. Is something that we think will go beyond where we currently see it. So the shift to digital means that more things are quantified, more things are measured, more things are stored. And because of that, you now have that as a perpetual resource if you have a database to store it in. So we're excited about that aspect of it changing and really seeing all of the mess of COVID and the way our world is changing right now as something that will kick us forward, that will help public engagement take the next step into what we believe is the next chapter of participatory democracy, where more people have access, more people have a voice. So it's a wonderful thing to see, and we're thrilled to work with organizations that embrace that. So we'll close out with a quote here, but the thought being that the more we conduct virtual meetings, the more we see the pros of doing virtual meetings, greater participation and a broader reach of participants. We think that's maybe sums up the whole idea of this. So when we think about reaching more people, when we think about improving our process, it comes down to who we're reaching and have we provided access to the broadest set of people possible. So that's an important part of this work, and there's certainly been some questions on this today, so I think we'll dive into questions next, but I want to close with that thought of access being such a critical piece of this. So Hunter, I know you're lined up some questions for us.
Yeah, and if anybody has questions, and if there are even comments that you want to convey, there are a couple of options to do that. Obviously, the comment box that you can see next to the screen that you're viewing this in. You can also use the call-in option. If you are on the phone already, you can hit, I believe it's *3, but the teleprompt will tell you, and you can record a comment or even connect into the meeting. But love to hear from anybody if there are questions. I wanted to point out, Jay, I think that in one of the most recent conversations I had, and one of the things I alluded to but didn't answer was FHWA guidance, and that may come in as a question, and I'll preempt it. But what we're seeing is that the FHWA is not going to issue guidance at a federal level, at a broad across the country blanket statement, but rather leave it to the regional at the regional level, the districts, to make their own decisions. And so what we're seeing is when public participation plans are submitted and the types of tools that you're going to use are laid out, they can be approved. So in North Carolina, relying on publicinput.com, and of course, there are other methods to make sure that they check the box for all the different types of public involvement that they need. They've received approval. So virtual public meetings can be a part of a sort of yes in the compliance department, but it is not going to come from the higher level FHWA. It's going to be left to regions.
The division level, I think, is definitely where we're seeing a lot of that guidance. But yeah, so questions that popped up here. I think this one's a great one from Jim in Rochester. So we're thinking about disadvantaged populations. We have a large proportion of deaf and hearing impaired individuals in our community. I'm curious if anyone has thought about a way to incorporate the picture-in-a-picture function with an interpreter, an ASL interpreter to be displayed. So depending on the platform you're using, if you're like us today on Zoom, you can pin that person's video as the primary. It means that whoever is speaking would not be visible while that person was interpreting. I think that's a limitation just of the video plus presentation aspect. I know if you don't have a presentation live, you can do a side-by-side likely. But I need to double check on WebEx, but I think that's a great point. If you have the resources to bring in an ASL interpreter that way, that's a great way to do it, so pinning that video. The other thought there is that, again, why we use the Facebook and YouTube channels for broadcasting. While I think Facebook may more consistently provide the live closed captions, YouTube doesn't necessarily provide live closed captions except for certain accounts. I haven't been able to figure out what their logic is about which accounts get it, which don't. But I do know that after the fact, once they process the videos, those closed captioning tools are available as well. So just a few different approaches there, but love the thought of the providing an interpreter. What are some of the best practices for ensuring EJ communities are included in digital public engagement? Great question. I know we spoke a little bit to that. The context is always key with that. The tools that we've seen used are, of course, things like the EPA's EJ screen, and folks that we've talked to essentially start there, but also look internally to staff that have done projects in that area as well, just to see what kind of resources are available, what kind of organizations they should be keeping in mind. So that first wave of identifying the right areas that we need to think about as traditionally underserved is step one. The next piece of that is thinking about what types of engagement formats are going to work. In an environment like this, if we know an area is lower income, it's smart to assume that broadband access is not going to be ubiquitous. So going back to some of the traditional outreach methods like mailers, but then providing a way to dial in, to leave a voice comment. And we've seen in some of the more rigorous public processes that there's a time limit on those voice comments, but if pre-meeting you want to remove that limit, let folks essentially just speak their comments, that provides a much lower barrier to participation. So again, it's going to be context specific, but using EJ Screen, thinking about those non-internet methods of engagement is a great way to really approach inclusivity. After you've done that, of course, we need to go back and look at our map of participants. If you can ask for address or zip code as part of those responses, you can map that and look and see how that compares. But ultimately, following up with additional either traditional outreach, most common we'll see like a targeted social media, like geographic outreach. Again, that does rely on smartphones or internet access, but another way to geographically close the gap. So if it's an open meeting, how do you record who attended? It's a great question. So we've got a couple different ways of setting this up. So on the back end, you're Your basic meeting that we had today, we did not set up a registration box for it. It was just they show up, and we're not really going to worry too much about collecting names and emails. You can require registration if that's an important element to you as part of your process. But ultimately, public input is just capturing whatever information is available about people as they arrive. So usually that's an IP address, and then we'll try to map that against the database of IP address to geodata. And so get an idea of geographically where your participants are coming from. And then if you ask any questions, even if you don't ask for contact info, you can still collect things like location or demographics. We're looking to standardize some of the things around what you might consider like a normal Title VI form. You know, a lot of those are paper and they are at the meeting. We'd love to digitize that and really help you produce those same kind of documentations of demographics and who you've reached. Let's see. Are you able to store email addresses? Do you collect those? Yes, great question. So address that briefly there. That is up to the organizer if you want to require registration, provide registration, but not require that it be collected. And ultimately, email addresses, phone, location, name, and any number of custom individual like CRM, contact relationship management attributes can be stored in your public input database. So if you go back and look at the history of interactions with any one person, all of those data points are included in their profile. So ultimately that gives you a place to store those things if you want to do follow-up email outreach, text messaging, phone outreach, that sort of thing. How do you source phone numbers for text and SMS option? So for that, we do have a couple clients that have purchased phone lists. We don't consider that necessarily the common practice and don't really push folks to do that. It's certainly available. It's just there's a number of limitations there. Ultimately, we see the best way that organizations have built databases of contacts is every time you do an engagement, being consistent with your process. So while we didn't collect email today, if you look at organizations like NCDOT or like Ohio DOT or a number of others like the City of Charlotte on the platform, they use an approach that's pretty consistent from engagement to engagement and make sure to include those contact questions. So when you look at the database, there's now over 1 million people with contact information in the public input database across a number of different organizations. And it's not one of these things that jumps up in terms of tons and tons of contacts at once. It's an intentional effort, and applying process yields growth over time. So that's been wonderful to see.
I might add to that just a best practice example that we saw from the ferry division in their text message engagement efforts. They have signs out, right, that offer that text in code. They say if you'd like to sign up for updates, whether those are late ferries or changes in the schedules, or if you'd like to leave feedback, text this code to this number, right? And what that does is give them the opportunity to, of course, hear, right, what people are thinking, but allows people to opt in. And so that's an approach that they're taking to make sure that they have the access to people who rely on the ferries when the weather delays or postpones ferry departures. So quick access, but through an opt-in type of situation.